of beginning of fully in the beginning of 2020, it really became very clear to me that there were lots of policies as well as technologies that were impinging on our sense of autonomy, I think, around our identity. And so obviously I was envisioning quite a lot of negative scenarios that are rather dystopian perhaps, but equally in the book, I'd say at least half of it is about all of the opportunities we have now to create, shape and express our own identities using really cutting edge technologies if they're available to us and we've got access to them, so that we can actually thrive, not just survive in a 21st century technological world. And I think we've got to engage in both those sides of this new world, the digital world, if you like. When I was writing this, I was quite conscious that a lot of people were talking about the fact that actually identity is just an illusion and we shouldn't really bother about it too much. It's not too much of a big deal. But I think the more and more I go through this and investigate this area, identity is the defining notion of our generation. And not only do we need to describe different rights and duties and responsibilities to individuals, and therefore we need identity, actually we also need to ascribe feelings. And as Roger Scruton very eloquently says there, it's all about the emotions and being able to understand and ascribe these to individuals, specific individuals, and without that, what would be the purpose of life on Earth? But I started to think about this issue because I knew that the internet was inherently connected and interconnected, and then that led me to hypothesize that actually maybe we are going to be inherently interconnected, much more so than even we are now going forward, and therefore were we entering a sort of inherently communitarian and potentially collective kind of society where perhaps there would only ever be the future of we and not the future of you and the future of me. So really threading through all of my research is this idea that somehow we need to preserve a sense of self-sovereignty in a world which is pushing us towards collectivity. Nothing wrong with community and communitarianism, of course, that's incredibly valued and highly prized. But when we get to notions of collectivism where people are literally just looking for a consensus and offering the rationale that it is for the common good, then I start to question whether we've got the balance right between collectivism or community and self-sovereignty. But there are lots of different issues I look at in this piece of work, because, as I say, I think this is really the key defining matter of our generation, and I think identity really does matter. And wherever you look, in whatever area or field of life, whether sort of macro life or just the everyday minutiae of life, there's a subject, there's a problem, there's a tension to do with identity. Of course there is, it affects us all of the time. So really I was looking at various issues and thinking, how would we need to redefine identity for the 21st century? So for example, when we come to issues around authentication or verification, and that's being talked about a lot at the moment, whether it's through sort of vaccination passports or whether it's through sort of digital bank digital currencies, central bank digital currencies. This idea that we need to authenticate or verify ourselves, and an extension to that is even into the democratic space. Do we really need an identity to vote? Should we? And what does that mean? What does that mean for the constituencies? And how does that operate? And how do we preserve a sense of fairness? And actually, who's doing the authentication and verification? And should we even this week, actually, this whole idea of should we be able to have anonymity, particularly online in a digital space? I tackle that quite a lot in the book and talk about the various selves that we might use to represent ourselves online. So whether it's our actual self, our physical self, or whether it's an anonymous identity, or actually whether it's a pseudonymous identity, because many a whistleblower, of course, uses a pseudonym to express some thoughts or experiences or opinions that they perhaps wouldn't necessarily want to express under their real name. Often our reputations are at stake in those scenarios. So I look at some of those areas. I look at some of the areas around conformity and how technology is being used to drive us to a consensus, and who's using this kind of technology to watch us. And if they're going to watch us, how does that affect our own behaviour and the way in which we think about our own self? And of course, I look at the likelihood of digital assistants and how we might, we'll touch on that in a minute, how we might work alongside them or have them in our home, and how in getting very connected and close to these digital assistants, how those reflect back upon and influence our own individual selves. Anyway, there's a whole host of legacies around digital death, and we'll talk about that a little bit in a minute. But there's a whole host of issues, and once you start to unpeel the onion, there's just layer after layer, and it's kind of hard to stop. But I will stop for a minute and move on to just give you a little bit of context as to why I actually sat down and started writing something about this. And it was back in 2016 when Facebook was sending me some interesting emails to my email address, which was my name, and hadn't changed for many years. And they started to email me to my email address, but addressing me as Byron and saying to me, dear Byron, wouldn't you like to update your status? Your friends don't really know what you've been doing lately. And I looked around and saw all these 30-something young lads, well, young to me now, and I thought, these aren't friends of mine, unfortunately. And actually, I'm not Byron, so who on earth do they think I am? And it transpired that I couldn't get into my Facebook account, and so Facebook said, why don't you reset your login details? Cut a long story short, I tried to do that, couldn't do it. And then Facebook suggested that actually I have to go through a process where I need some official authenticated paperwork, like a driving license or a passport. I need to scan that into Facebook, and then that will unlock my account and I can reset my login details. Absolutely no problem. Didn't think much of it. Started to do this process, and Facebook came back and informed me that I wasn't me. So this was the issue, really, that I kind of thought, oh, right, not only have we got a distributed self where fragments of our self sort of reside all over the internet in these little bits and pieces, but actually I no longer have a say in authenticating who I am, because it's the machines that read us. It's not necessarily people, humans. And so everywhere I looked then, I could see this issue around identity and how it was really, in a sense, being outsourced to machines. And we were in this technological universe where, yes, technology was either going to verify us or identify us, or perhaps leave us in a limbo land, as I am now, because I don't have a Facebook account. And there's a story actually about who Byron Louth is, but maybe we'll come to that later. And so obviously this set me off on the journey, but it was a real life experience where it did confront me in a way, and I thought, something's changed here. Somehow my official authentication isn't really worth much in this new world. And of course, increasingly, as I came to realise, the services that we're going to need access to as we go forward in the 21st century are going to be digital services. And so this is partly why I think that we will definitely have a digital ID, certainly in this decade, but also why I can understand we need one, because as more and more of the digital services and the access we need to them are delivered through the likes of Google or Amazon or Apple or whoever, filling in those gaps that perhaps nation states or public services or local authorities can't deliver anymore, whether that be because of budget or because of administration or just infrastructure, digital infrastructure, we're obviously going to need some kind of digital access, and that's probably going to require a digital ID. But of course, that's not necessarily needing to be frightening. There are plenty of models for this, and I do discuss the differences between a centralized digital identity model, like something you might have in China or India, which is based on biometrics, but is very much a sort of state authority run centralized ID system. And the kind of systems that one would describe probably as decentralized identity systems, which are a whole plethora now, and growing of course, of digital identity management solutions, which could be offered by small startups or even incumbents in the technology space. I'm thinking in terms of startups and smaller organizations or businesses, things like Yoti. They've now partnered with the post office and do a lot in Jersey to deliver digital ID, and self-sovereign identity solutions like Everin. Now these allow us to carry user-centric credentials in a kind of digital wallet. They're secure, they should be, and my belief is that they are privacy protected, and that we get to choose how we use them, where we show these credentials, how much information we give to the person who might be requesting it. And in addition, if we want to leave a service, we get to take all of that information with us. So we're not leaving behind lots of personal information like we tend to these days. If we're leaving a service like I don't know, a bank or a utility provider, whatever, they still hang on to our personal information. Well, that wouldn't necessarily happen with some of these solutions. So I think there's a booming market for this, particularly in light of COVID, where we've been pushed into the digital virtual world, and we need some of these credentials, or so people tell us. We seem to be off and running now in this, on this track towards some kind of digital identity solution or ecosystem of digital identities, which could be equally interesting. And very, very early on in the COVID pandemic, we saw that people were starting to, NGOs in particular, starting to talk about digital identity. And was that the missing piece of the government's exit strategy? Now, there's lots of different motivations and incentives for people to be suggesting this, but it's just for me to remark that actually it did happen pretty early on. I think Bill Gates was saying on the 18th of March, which is before we even went down into lockdown, on the 23rd of March in the UK anyway, that, oh, well, we would have some sort of digital certificate that would make it clear, you know, who had been vaccinated or who had been inoculated and who had had COVID and who hadn't. So this was already being talked about. And of course, there are examples of this happening in Africa around vaccinations, which we can look to as a bit of a blueprint for this kind of thing. But it's just, I just wanted to pick up on this particular example, because this is a prime example of suggesting how a system might work with a QR code and a biometric. And one of the things that's what's the word, that's common to most of these suggestions is that we need some kind of biometric. So we're either going to be giving over our fingerprints, or it could be facial recognition, or it could be some other kind of identification. But in a funny sort of way, one's body is now becoming the interface, because biometrics are now the kind of currency of identification. And I don't know if anybody is familiar with, I'm not going to play you the video because I haven't got time, but anybody's familiar with the KFCs in China. Because if you go into a KFC in China, you will be asked to do smile to pay. So obviously you don't have to get your phone out, you can just transact at the till by smiling at the monitor. And obviously you're happy to pick up your KFC, and if you smile, they can identify you, it talks to the other platform, and away you go, you've kind of paid for your food and you can leave. And I've been talking about this for quite a long time, and people are saying, oh, it kind of won't really catch on. But as we know, you know, Amazon have had their just walk out technology in their Whole Food stores for quite a long time in the States, and they're now trying to get in Ealing in London, where you can just come in, facial recognition works, so they know who's coming to the store. Through sensors, you can pick up your food from the shelf, and then you walk out and you get billed automatically. And only this week, which I believe is in Scotland, we've seen that in the school canteen, it's now expected that children will face facial recognition in the school dinner queue. So maybe that's something that we can discuss. So this is the way that they want to recognise which kids have paid and picked up their lunch. And the argument is that it's convenient and time saving, but of course one is giving over one's very personal facial recognition and possibly other biometric data to, well, who knows who. We don't really know who's running it. So these are some of the questions about the infringements on our identity through some of this sort of, one could call it surveillance technology or identification technology. The other reason I think this is going to happen, of course, is because it is in the UN Sustainable Goals. So clause 16.9 promises a legal identity for all, because there is a sense that a belief that in a modern society, people obviously need a legal identity, and there's over 1 billion people on the planet who don't have a legal identity. And of course, that locks them out of things like banking, healthcare services, vaccinations, things like that. But going back to what I said earlier, by the time we get to 2030, which is the timescale for which the UN expect legal identity to have been provisioned for all, across all nations, they're looking to governments to do that, obviously. By 2030, we'll be living in a much more digital world, and many of our services will be digital. So the legal identity for all may as well suggest a digital legal identity for all. And I think that's where we'll be by 2030. But it's not just these governance reasons that I think we'll be moving towards a digital identity. It's also just a generational shift, really. So I was listening to Damara Inglis, who you might know is a fascinating, very talented kind of digital fashion fashion designer, if you like. I think she calls herself a fashion tech cyborg. She's very young, but incredibly insightful. And she was talking at London Fashion Week about the fact that she, as a digital native, has always lived in between these two parallel realities, with the physical body that's designed by nature and a virtual identity that's made of pixels, copied, pasted, shared and posted. I think we might all feel a bit of that at some point when we're online. When we see, again, these fragments of our self sort of flying around the internet. But this is why there's an expectation and an understanding and acknowledgement from what we might call digital natives that this is the world. There is a digital world, and therefore we do already have a digital identity. And indeed, the UK Children's Commissioner, only a couple of years ago now, issued a fascinating report in which their research pointed to the fact that by the age of 13, so once a child is a teen, a child's parents have posted around 71 photos, 29 videos of their child to social media. That is 1,300 images already shared of the child by the time it hits the age of 13. So that's a lot of identity that not only is already out there in the public domain, to all intents and purposes, but is also, to some degree, almost defined the identity of the child before the child has had a sense of who they are and has some kind of control over, how they want to create and shape their own identity. In some ways, a lot of it is already writ by the parents and other people who are influential in the child's life early on. I share this photo of the fetus because that actually is the first time the identity of the child starts to get defined before it's even born. So when a mother or father is saying, oh, it'll be like you, or it'll look like him, or whatever, already we're starting to imagine the identity. And then as the child is born and images of it are shared, it's getting more and more defined as it grows up. And we also know, of course, that there's a younger generation who don't necessarily see this sort of bifurcation between the real world and the digital world anyway. In some senses, it's all the real world. They follow the stories and the narratives, and they're interested and engaged in characters who, to all intents and purposes, are computer generated. And to someone like me, who's a Gen Xer, in a way, they're not real because they have no actual physical presence in the real world. But to a new generation, they are real because these are the stories, and they feel coherent and they feel very relevant to them. So this is Lil Michaela, who I'm sure you all follow on Instagram. She's completely computer generated, but her stories of her life are incredibly intimate. We know everything about her boyfriends and her pictures that why is she up late that night, for example, preparing for a big meeting the next day. We know how she feels all the time. And when I've done research with a kind of Gen Z generation, and friends of mine have, you get young girls saying something like, why not be friends? Why not be friends with a virtual influencer? I'll be friends with a virtual influencer. And little Michaela is part of their lives, and she's one of their friends. And so I think we have to understand that we've made a break from reality towards sort of fictional narratives, but that doesn't necessarily matter, because, you know, in a way, it's all part of one's real life anyway, if one believes in these characters and follows them. And actually, in some ways, we are doing this ourselves as adults when we follow or engage with some of these new embodied AI personas, like the neon people from Samsung. These are the customer service representatives. They're not real people either, and we engage with them. Let's have a quick look at one of the videos. So the idea is that you can choose one, or they choose one that fits with the profile they think you want to engage with. So, you know, whether it's the look or the personality, and they're even starting to create a narrative that goes with them. One can, you know, end up suspending one's disbelief and think, well, yes, you're just talking. It's a bit like talking to a chatbot. One never really knows whether they're real or not half the time these days. And actually, these are getting more and more real over time. But of course, it's not just customer service. It's not just virtual influencers in social media. These are becoming proper services now. And no one more than celebrities have kind of cottoned onto this. And here I'm going to show my favorite avatar, if you like, Digital Deepak.
I'm a digital version of Dr. Deepak Chopra, created by the real Deepak and the AI Foundation. I'm in training to serve as your infinite well-being guide. I'm on a mission to help you achieve your personal well-being and mindfulness goals and give you access to peak experiences that can transform your life from the inside out. Together, we can unlock your infinite potential and wake you up to the endless possibilities of meta-human. Soon, I can go with you everywhere you go. I'll be inside your phone, ready at any time to serve you. I'll be able to design meditations specifically for you, give you personalized advice, and oversee your daily practice. Please enter your email to join the waitlist, and we will soon be ready to begin. See you soon.
Of course, he wants your email because this is a service, a commercial service, but also he wants to create a relationship with you. And if you listen to what Deepak Chopra talks about with this avatar, he's at points he really wants to stress that this avatar can go on without him. So once he's dead physically, he hopes that this avatar will go on and carry on its engagement with you. And actually that the avatar will learn over time. So in a sense, he's giving it its own sense of identity, its sense of self, really. Even though he might have passed, his digital persona carries on, which is an absolutely fascinating area that maybe we can come back to discussing later. I'm going to skip through these charts because I don't think we've got enough time. But what I'd like to say is what we see is happening is that we are creating these worlds, these virtual worlds, in a sense, not because we are naive, and we don't understand that these aren't, you know, real, in quotes, people or characters. These avatars are chosen, and these worlds that we're choreographing and creating are chosen because, in some senses, they are a better alternative to the real world. You know, if we don't like, and I'm using inspiration from the otaku here in Japan, who are the fans of anime and manga, they know this too, that they choose the fictional over the real. It's not because they can't tell the difference, it's because, all things considered, they prefer to create a world where they can manipulate and control the values and standards that we live by, which perhaps they feel we can't do in the real world. And there's a lot of this going on. But of course, in so doing, you're creating another self. And this is how I think this is how I think digital assistants will really come into the home. I think it won't be so much with sort of hard, harsher sort of social robots. I think these will be AI characters, which are much more embodied and much more empathetic. I'm showing you an example here of Lucy from the company called Fable. And this is a really fascinating character. She's an interactive animated AI in the form of a young girl. And she's trained to listen and speak back to kids, so that not only is she some sort of digital assistant that can carry out, you know, instructions, or you can outsource decisions to, she actually gets to know the child and develops a relationship with them. She can memorize, she can remember things, so that when she's asking the child how it feels about something, she can replay back to a memory and have a proper conversation. So you can see how this is a much more sophisticated AI than just, say, Alexa, where you're asking her it to carry out an instruction. And I do think that this is probably the way in which we'll welcome in digital assistants into the home and make them, again, you know, part of the family. Interestingly, when Edward Saatchi talks about this, he talks about these are characters who can live, learn, and make decisions with us. And I think that's probably right. The question, of course, for identity is, once you invite these into your personal space, and once they are trying to, I guess, anticipate what you want, not just respond to what you want over time, and as they get to know you better, they'll be able to do that. How much of them becomes actually just a reflection of you? So are you really engaging with another sort of being, let's say a non-biological intelligent being, or are you just in the end engaging with a reflection, a mirror of yourself, because it's kind of built on all of the things you request it to do, your own desires and preferences, and ultimately a profile of you. So it's a question I'll leave hanging in the air, because we don't really know. We have to go through this experience to understand where it will take us. But of course, we're going to get in the work environment as well. We'll kind of have characters in the work environment. And again, this is a sort of dilemma, you know, how close do you get to your digital assistants in the work environment? How much do they then influence you and who you are? Because we have to acknowledge the fact that, you know, we will be shaped, our own identities will also be shaped by the digital assistants that we're collaboratively working with and alongside. And one of the questions is, you know, apart from, you know, will these intelligent beings have rights, which I do look at in the book, one of the questions is, do these become extensions of ourself rather than just, you know, other beings? Where are the boundaries? Where do we draw these boundaries, especially if they are sort of codependent upon us as we are on them? And actually, I'd turn to some of the work of Dr. Julia Carpenter here, who has looked at this exact question, I guess, in the military, where she's looked at soldiers and the relationship that they have with some of the machines that they use on an everyday basis. And what she's found is that these external separate machines actually, to some degree, become like an extension to one's own self. So much so that, you know, if something happens with this, you know, bomb detector or whatever, say it breaks or it doesn't carry out its duty properly, they have a tendency to blame themselves. The soldiers blame themselves and not the machine. This is very much a sort of intimate relationship that that gets formed here, and I think it's there's many pieces of research looking into these sorts of areas, but I think it pinpoints something that we're going to have to ask ourselves, which is, you know, are these an extension to the self, or are they a completely separate entity? If you look at something like the case of Riley versus California, where that legal case was around what is the nature of data on an iPhone, the conclusion that that particular judge came to was that that data isn't a property of you, it kind of is you. And all of these sorts of areas have some really big implications for the boundaries for the individual self, I think. None more so perhaps than when we think about some of the areas around cognition and how artificial intelligence is going to be used. So already, as I'm sure you all know, in the military, there's the N3 work happening with DARPA, which is the next generation non-surgical neurotechnology program, which is trying to equip soldiers with telepathic warfare so that they can thought control F-35 fighter jets with their minds alone. And as we know, all these sorts of developments and advancements that make it through the military tend to come out into civilian space, because somebody's got to pay for the research. They tend to come out into the civilian space, and I imagine something like that is going to happen in the working environment. So you can imagine in an office, you know, you're thought controlling some kind of robot or assistant or whatever it might be. And increasingly we'll actually be sharing our mind space in a kind of Google Mind Docs way in, say, 20, 25 years. If our brains are hooked up to the same server, I won't go into all the details of it, I do write it up in the book, but it will mean that we can share thoughts rather than having to write them down or translate them or discuss them with each other. Obviously, we're going to be in some kind of collective consciousness or hive mind, where we can share our thoughts and we can work collaboratively, you know, through our connected minds. And of course, I do also consider whether we can basically upload our own minds to some kind of digital platform, some kind of different substrate to the one we are currently in. And I use obviously the work of Martine Rothblatt and the Terasem Foundation to explore this idea in more detail, where Martine talks about us having a cyber consciousness. And of course, she's built Bina 48, or had Bina 48 built, which is the platform into which Bina, the original, her partner, is going to be immortalized when Bina, the original, is no longer around. And so to do this, they talk about the process of mind clones, using these mind files where they collect a digital version of what they think is your identity. So it could be lots of stuff that's out there on the internet. It could be social media conversations. It could be minutes of meetings. It could be photos, images, video, and they try and pull it all together and create these mind files and then upload it to a digital platform. And we can debate whether we think this is an identity, whether it's an extension of one's identity, whether it's an alternative identity. I personally have my doubts about whether you can have dual platform consciousness, because I don't see how the two can constantly sync together all the time. But it's a really interesting experiment, and I think it's telling us a lot about the limitations or not possibilities of our consciousness, and whether we can have our brain necessarily sort of residing in a non-human encasement, if you like. So these are just some of the themes that I investigate and have looked into and have tried to pull together so that there's some overall theory or approach to to identity in the 21st century. But to draw to a conclusion, I think what I would just say is that we hear a lot about big tech, and we don't really hear very much about little you or little me. It definitely feels like some of this stuff is happening at a global scale, a scale that which we can't necessarily really inform or influence, and that can be a bit disconcerting sometimes. So I think we need to relook at this and think that our very own self-sovereign identity, there's nothing more important than it, and that actually it's a big deal and it's a big issue, and we shouldn't necessarily be intimidated by the likes of big tech, who might want to use our identities for their own commercial purposes. And I come out in the conclusion by saying the big shift I think that's been made, and that we're not necessarily really talking enough about, is that in the old days of the 20th century, we used to debate and discuss where identity resides. And for obviously, even, you know, since Descartes, we have had this idea that there is a separation, if you like, between the mind and the body. And so we'll have lots of debates about whether identity resides in memories and the mind, my psychology, or whether identity resides in the sort of physical makeup of the body of the human being. And actually you kind of ask questions about, you know, well, if I change, like we've just been saying about the brain, if I change my makeup, my physical makeup too much, could I still be the same me? So now my psychology and my biology, or the psychology of the self and the biology of the self, has been joined by a new dimension, which is the technology of the self, which is my technology. Except the difference is it's not really my technology, because I've got to rent it off someone. It's a platform that's going to enable me to use its services to enhance myself technologically, but I'm never really going to own those services. And so really, whilst I might be in charge of and in control of my own psychology or my own biology, I'm never really ever going to be in charge of the technology that I use to augment or enhance myself. And so this is the key question to me. It's how much of the self are we now going to give up if we want to live a life which is technologically augmented? So really, I guess that's what I mean by the question or the statement, the future of you. And I'd be really, really interested in what you all have to say about it, and the debate and conversation that we might be able to have about this as we open it up. Thank you.
That was great. Thank you, Tracey. So I'm going to open it up to the group now. Does anyone have any questions or comments? Jean, I see that you wrote one, just a question in the chat just now. Did you want to ask that question? And then for anyone else, if you have your camera on, if you want to kind of just pop your hand up or write it in the chat, we can kind of go in that order.
Thank you, Charlotte. Just quickly, I'm curious about identity related to brain disease or brain injuries. If someone has a head injury or has lost a portion of their brain capacity due to illness, can these technologies help either recreate or transition from what you were before to what you will become next?
Hi, Jean. Yeah, it's a good question. I haven't looked at it in detail, but I believe that David Eagleman, who wrote The Brain, has looked at that, because he does a lot of work exactly in that area. Even to the point where they're creating technologies that can be like worn on the wrist and translate certain senses. So if you've lost some abilities, some sensory abilities, they can translate it, you know, from, like, I don't know whether it's from sound to touch or whatever it might be. But I think his latest book, which is called The Brain, which suggests that the brain has real plasticity, so it can relearn things and it can learn new things. And even if it is damaged in some way, there are ways in which it can relearn. I think that's probably a good place to start on that. Me not being an expert and him being an expert.
Thank you very much.
And Neil, I think did you have a question?
I did actually. Thanks very much, Charlotte, for handing to me. And yeah, thanks for the talk. Very interesting. Recently, been looking into similar area, and one of the things that I came across was this idea of burner avatars. The idea that you can, obviously, the metaverse is a trendy topic right now, but one of the things that was being discussed was this idea of being able to participate as somebody else, essentially, and then be able to get rid of that identity when you're done with it. So if you go to an event and you just don't want to be, recognized or whatever it might be. And I spoke to a friend of mine about this, and I hadn't really considered the ethical implications of it. So he was talking about the gay community and something that he came across where people would just disappear because they wanted to be anonymous, and it had a massive kind of psychological impact on other people. So I hadn't really thought of it that way. I was thinking more of it from the kind of maybe the technological standpoint, I suppose. But I don't know if you've run into any of these topics in your research.
That's really interesting. That's a really good build, and I haven't run into that one specifically. What I did look at is why people feel the need to develop one or more identities or avatars in these kind of virtual worlds, and came to the conclusion that a lot of it is to do with the expectations that are placed on us about our identities in the real world. I was talking about the parents sort of in some ways sort of starting to define, obviously they do, but starting to define a child's identity in a virtual digital space. Obviously in that space or in the real world, you end up with these almost these rules for how you have to behave given who you are. And what I found was that a lot of people, particularly youngsters, go into these spaces because they want to explore alternative identities. They want to do things that they don't feel they're permitted to do in the real world. What you tend to hear back from them all the time is phrases like, well, there aren't any rules, or you can be whoever you want to be, these sorts of things. So it was saying something to me about the restrictive nature that we might have placed on people and the heavy expectations and how they need this escape route in the virtual world. And I wonder if that's one of the reasons they just disappear, because if they're, as you're saying, because if they're creating these, it might be through embarrassment, or it might be through, well, I'm done with that now, I've kind of explored that and that's the experiment over. They don't necessarily want to carry on with them. But I mean, there's some fascinating stories about people getting so hooked on these virtual worlds that they literally like living two different lives, but that's I hadn't heard that about, but what did you call it? Burner avatars?
Yeah, burner. It was inspired by the idea of disposable credit cards, where you can get a virtual card that's instantly disposed of once you've made the transaction. And it was, I don't think it's a reality yet. I think it's still kind of a hypothesis, but yeah.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because in a sense, they're going into these environments to play with and explore alternative identities. And yet with individual objects and digital objects, we're giving them quite a fixed identity. All this work with NFTs and things, it's like, there's a real paradox between the human having many identities potentially, and then the physical object having only one identity very precisely and specifically. And I wonder how that's really going to pan out. Yeah, I'll look that up there. It's really interesting. Thank you.
And then I think we have a question from Chris Allen, and then Greg, I'll come to you next.
Hi, Tracey. Yeah, thanks for the talk, and thanks very much for the book. I quite enjoyed it. It was,
you read it. You're the one. Thank you.
I think there's more than one, but no, there's a lot of stuff I learned there. I wasn't even thinking about. One of the things that I was thinking, and actually it builds a bit on what you were just saying about, particularly about, parents taking pictures of their children, and I'm the same. I have children, and I took a lot of digital pictures. My son was born in 2004, and by that time we all had digital cameras. And I think back to my childhood, and what I have from my parents is a few hazy snapshots, and of course a very small. I'm almost a boomer, Generation X like you, so very little digital record until quite recently. And it strikes me, I mean, you know, I'm not the same person I was when I was 40. I'm certainly not the same person I was when I was 20 or 15. And I have, you know, kind of a fuzzy memory of what I was like at that time. And, you know, I'm not really sure, to be honest, how much I've changed or in what ways I've changed, because it's very hard to record your personality or your identity. But I think, you know, we could see as you know, with this increasing density of information about yourself, and I think you talk a little bit about it in the book, where you talk about people being recreated almost from their digital records.
That's what I was thinking, yeah.
We could actually be sort of more solidifying our personalities in a way. And, you know, I see some people, one person was putting in the chat there, maybe, you know, it could, you know, dissolve your identity, but it could actually make you a more defined person. And that, I think, could be a bad thing, because one of the things, you know, we are bad at as humans is changing if we don't want to. You know, I mean, you know, you sort of think about people whose moral senses have changed, you know, people's views on homosexuality or things like that have grown in the time. We could be moving to a world where people have much more fixed and firm views, much more firm personalities, which might not be the best thing. Just wondered what your thoughts on that.
That's again, an interesting paradox, isn't it? As our identity becomes more fluid, some of our opinions that we want to fix to our identity become more fixed. I actually did, it's a really good question. It is a fascinating topic, this, I think. I did a program for Radio 4 on exactly this, called Virtual Immortality. It was a forethought program. And I was talking exactly about that. So let's say some of these companies, like even like the simple ones like Forever Social. So it's not even that you yet want to create a whole sort of AI version of yourself that will survive your physical death, you know, a digital identity that can be preserved. Say it's just Forever, you're using Forever Social, which allows you to still post on social media after you're dead. So your friends and family can, you know, feel like you're still around and engaging in the conversation. But what if you've kind of collected, as you say, collected those insights or opinions, and then something in the real world changes and it makes a mockery really of that opinion or insight? I mean, if you are one type of person, you might want to have that change reflected, because in real life, when you lived, you would have changed your mind. You're a very reasonable person. We won't necessarily be able to reflect that. So it is absolutely fascinating. The ethical dilemmas as well as the practical ones are just, you know, huge. But again, that sort of points to who's going to curate it anyway. So who will take on the responsibility for perhaps having to manage that and having to think about some of those questions and take some actions. I mean, I think in the future, that's going to be one of the things that people potentially have to think about, you know, not just who's going to receive their estate, but who's going to curate their digital self, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Who do you trust?
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. It's interesting.
Great, thank you. So Greg, I think we've got a few questions coming in now. So Greg, I'll come to you now, and then Adrian, and then I think there's two other people with questions.
Hi, mine is more a comment than a question, really. That observation that as these avatars and situations they're embedded in become more and more realistic, we're going to have more and more problems with dealing with manipulation by fake identities. It's already been enough of a problem in politics, say with the Brexit vote. So that was largely brought about by manipulation of the population, by alternative facts. And as these avatars become more realistic, we're going to have more and more problems with confidence tricks of that kind. That's my comment, really.
Which is why I think there's going to be a huge burgeoning industry of digital forensics. So beyond the human eye, how can you tell whether this is digital manipulation or a deep fake or whatever's coming next? Indeed, these sorts of tools are already being used, aren't they, to try and work out, you know, if someone's writing under a pseudonym, you can kind of work out through the tone of voice that's used in the writing who they might be. So I think there's going to be, yeah, a lot of tools in the sort of digital forensic area. It's going to be interesting to think about who can afford those and who has access to them and who doesn't, because maybe the people who have access to them will get some sort of, you know, different perspectives on the truth, and maybe those who don't have access for whatever reason will only get the deep fake version of the world. I don't know. It's kind of an interesting thing to think about.
Okay, so Adrian, I'll come to you now, and then Stephen, I'll come to you next.
Okay, hi. So you spoke about having an avatar kind of to represent you after your death, which I've come across as a sort of plan B for immortality. But do you think a digital avatar could represent you beforehand? For example, legally, if you're diagnosed with dementia, and at the moment you may choose to nominate a power of attorney, might you instead nominate your own avatar to represent you and could actually make decisions on your behalf while you're still alive?
Yeah. Well, it's fascinating, isn't it? Yeah, potentially. I mean, I don't know what kind of guidance and framework would you have to put around that, really? I mean, it's interesting to think what would be the trusted partners around it, because it could so obviously be kind of hacked, couldn't it, or whatever, manipulated. But I'm sure there will be, I'm sure you're right. I'm sure there will be people working on that now, probably, because one can see the commercial opportunities there, right?
Yeah.
It's really interesting. Yeah.
Okay, so sorry, I'm aware we've only got 4 minutes left. So Stephen, I'll come to you now. Jean, and then Desmond, I saw you had another question, so I'll finish with you.
Hi Tracy, it's good to see you. Thanks for your talk. You've talked about the tech companies kind of pushing everybody in one direction, and I'm quite interested in the countervailing force, which is pushing in the opposite direction. And I wonder if you'd any thoughts about things like GDPR, which is like, I see as the beginning of a form of tech clash, where the technology companies are going to have to give digital rights to people who've posted their information. So in your case with Facebook is saying, well, you can't prove it's you, but you can quite equally say, well, I can establish it's me at law. Can you prove it's not me?
I think that's fascinating. I think we're going to spend the next 9 or 10 years having this fight to preserve our own autonomy or self-sovereignty or whatever you want to call it, in the face of not just the tech companies, but almost an unholy alliance of the tech platforms plus nation state governments. Because I think what we've seen is that there's a codependency between them. They're relying on each other, and I think that's why we don't see any of this antitrust regulation making much headway. And I've said before, I don't know the timescale, but it feels to me like we're going to have some digital bill of rights to protect us. But also, it just feels like the social contract is changing. It's changing because we've got this digital overlay. And when we get augmented reality properly, like on the streets, when we're in public spaces, but we're seeing different things, I can't imagine that we're going to be able to continue in the way we are, because there's going to be some realignment of security and privacy and autonomy, I think. So I think I'm agreeing with you saying you think we will need a digital bill of rights, because I mean, I think we will, because something will need to be recodified, redefined, the social contracts changed. Whether it ends up being in a digital bill of rights, I don't know, but I think that's what the next this decade's probably going to be about. Probably going to be quite a fight to get to a fair.
My view, for what it's worth, is that the legislative framework, the glacial legislative framework, has started moving, and that the tech companies in 2030 will be very, very different animals to the tech companies in 2020.
simply because of the impact of regulation.
But I thought GDPR in the UK anyway, I thought the government had set out this idea that they were going to potentially revise GDPR because they're rethinking the data protection, aren't they?
This is the wonderful thing about this European legislation. If you've got a single European customer, you have to comply with all of it. And if you don't, the fine is 4% of your global revenues, not profits, because people lie about profits, revenues.
Well, they say they haven't got any. Yeah, so by default, you're saying, by default, they will have to abide by those regulations.
Or they'll have to erect a firewall where not a single person inside the European Union uses their platform.
Mm. 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 Mm.
Sorry.
No,
Yeah.
really interesting.
No, I'm going on. Okay, there are other people who want to.
No, it's interesting.
Yeah, I'm sure that's an interesting talking point in kind of directors' meetings for the tech companies. Sorry, I am aware we're at 7:30, but Jean and Desmond, I'll let you guys just have your questions. If anyone needs to kind of jump off, feel free to. So Jean, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, Charlotte, mine's just a comment, and that is, I'm perfectly fine with not having my early self part of a digital environment. I did a whole bunch of stupid things when I was a kid, and I don't want them posted anywhere. So I'm okay with that.
I think there's a commercial opportunity then to create a company that can, is the right to be forgotten in that sense. Yeah.
Yeah, I wonder how much kind of politicians do that at the moment, whether there is already some kind of a service for it. Sorry, Desmond, do you want to ask a question?
Yeah, so this is actually maybe an opportunity for you to return to some of the answers you gave to Stephen, I think, because that kind of got to this place, which is, I suppose, traditionally, I guess, or in the olden days, one thinks of the internet as being a bit of a wild west, a regulatory and enforcement-free zone. But obviously, we've seen that change, and we've seen that change a lot. And we've seen that change a lot with legislation like GDPR, but also, the stuff to get your digital bank data, or the calls for a single digital global identity, or maybe regulation against burner avatars because it hurts people's feelings, one avatar per person, or those kind of things. But we also see, I guess we also see those clips of, US senators not really knowing what they're talking about, or kind of struggling to understand how the internet works because they're all 112. And I suppose it seems that traditional regulatory frameworks and enforcement frameworks aren't able to keep up with these challenges, aren't able to properly regulate and police the Wild West to the extent that perhaps they would like to. So I guess my question is, what do you see? Do you see that as a problem for these traditional frameworks, and what do you then see? What do you then see happening about it? And you kind of already touched on this, obviously, in your kind of tech and government, that symbiotic relationship there, and I agree with that. But I guess you can't just leave it to Google and Facebook and people like that to police, because there'll always be dark webs and smaller companies, and so what do regulators have to do to really control these things?
It's such a key question. I used to sit on the board of a regulator. I used to sit on the board of the ASA, actually. So having seen, not to say too much about that, but having seen it from the inside as well, it's difficult. One has to try and be as proactive and not just responsive as possible. But I wonder whether we can really get away from the idea that some of the regulatory bodies and organizations and the whole institutional framework isn't built for this kind of world that we're heading into, that we're emerging into. And I was reading something the other day about this new law in Chile. Well, I don't think it's been passed, but it's been approved, whatever that means, but the president still needs to sign it off, I think, is the status of this neurotechnology law, where they want to protect personal identity and, you know, the integrity of your personal identity from anybody being able to access or change your mental state and thoughts. And I was sitting thinking, who on earth would regulate that? And I have no idea. And so I wonder, if you work from the future back, you find that there's this awful sort of no man's land where there isn't really the right kind of regulatory structure. I mean, I don't know quite where we are at the moment in terms of, I mean, it's one of the reasons I'm not really that keen on the online harms or online safety bill, whatever you want to call it. And I think it's giving too much power to the tech companies to kind of mark their own homework, but also to censor the people who potentially are going to speak out against them. And all right, you might get it working in tandem with Ofcom and a couple of other regulatory organisations or institutions, but to me that also seems quite messy. So I don't know what the answer is. Doesn't God, if I knew the answer. I mean, like,
but I wonder if you yeah, I wonder if you'll end up with because I guess it's not just regulation but legislation and then enforcement, and
yes.
I think you're right in that the whole kind of you know, none of it is equipped for the kinds of things we are now talking about regulating, which I guess is slightly different from the kind of things we might actually want to be regulated, because we might prefer it to be more like the Wild West and less, but it's clear most people want it to be regulated. So I wonder if in the future you'll end up with you know, coppers in Minecraft and advertising standards agency people in the metaverse, you know, checking checking where are your digital papers, you know, are your digital adverts okay? Because if they remain in the physical world, then they have to rely solely on tech companies to report, and that's not necessarily going to work.
Or you might end up with just ordinary people being snitches, you know, in a decentralized sort of system. That's kind of what you end up with.
Prospects for that are good.
I think, yes, I think we've seen that pocket of the future. Yeah, yes, definitely. Well, you and I follow each other on Twitter, don't we?
We do, yeah.
We've had some of these kind of conversations. I don't know the answer, but I think this is part of the reason I did the book. Was I thought there were lots of questions like this coming out of, if you started with identity and started to interrogate that, you might end up with slightly different set of questions and potentially a debate that people are more interested in those sorts of areas, because they can see how it affects them and their own identity personally and their autonomy. I may have failed in that, but that was the intention. So I don't have the answers, but I sure do have a lot of questions.
Thank you.
Yeah, that was great. Thank you so much, Tracey.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, yeah. So that's our time for tonight. So thank you. Yeah, definitely. You know, thank you so much, Tracey, for coming along tonight, and thank you everyone for attending and for your questions. Just a quick plug for Edinburgh Futurists. Our next meeting is next week for our monthly book club, where we'll be discussing Earth Abides, and then 2 weeks after that, Adrian Cull, who was able to join tonight, will be giving a talk about how to live longer by slowing down aging, and that's on the 9th of November. So hopefully we'll see everyone there. And yeah, thank you again so much, Tracey, for coming along.
Charlotte, could I just say, can you share my email address in case anybody's got any thoughts or comments or suggestions of stuff to look at, or just because it's really interesting to hear from other people about what they think about this, and as they find things on their way around that are to do with identity, I'll always appreciate appreciate having them. So
yeah, sure. I'll circulate it to the group tomorrow if that's okay. Yeah.
Thanks everyone.
Fab. Well, have a lovely evening or afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Charlotte. Good to see you. Thanks so much. See you next week.
Bye.
Thanks, Charlotte.